So, Easter is right around the corner, and I'm sure many of you are probably wondering, why is this day so significant? Or maybe not, I could just be some random nerd talking on TikTok. But I like to share a cultural and historical perspective of why this day is so important to many people. So, in the very beginnings of Judaism, we meet a man named Abraham. Mind you, there were other religions going on before this, there were other belief systems in the area he was living in, which was the land of Canaan. But he connects with a god named Yahweh. And Yahweh promises him descendants as numerous as the stars. But Abraham and his wife Sarah are super old, and he's not sure of Yahweh's ability to make his wife Sarah pregnant. But Yahweh continuously promised that he will have a promised son. Abraham doesn't really believe, so he ends up sleeping with the servant Hagar and has a child with her. And then not too long after, Sarah does end up pregnant. And it's really a miracle, because how can a woman who was about 90 years old, or maybe even older than that, have a baby? So sadly and unfairly, Hagar gets kicked out of the tribe, along with their child. And Abraham and Sarah named their child Isaac, which means he will laugh, because they laughed at the fact that she had a child so old. So when Isaac gets a little older and Abraham builds a bond with him, Yahweh basically tells him, yo, you have to sacrifice your child. And so Abraham was absolutely appalled by this. Why does he have to sacrifice the only child that he has, especially after all the problems he had to go through just to have the dang thing? So anyway, he carries on with the mission, having full faith in Yahweh. He basically takes Isaac on a camping trip, and Isaac doesn't know what's about to happen to him. And Abraham pleaded with Yahweh to see if he could sacrifice something else to appease him besides his son. But nope, he still got to take Isaac up to the mountain and try to sacrifice him. So he begrudgingly sets up the sacrifice for his son, and then he's about to unalive him until a ram comes through and stops basically what was about to happen, and is seen as a sign from God to sacrifice the ram instead of his son. So depending on your interpretation of that story and how you feel about it, and maybe you grew up hearing it 1,000 times or it's your first time hearing it, some people think it's terrible that Yahweh or God would tell a faithful follower to sacrifice his child, and others see it as the coming of Christ. But some people question, including myself, like, why did Yahweh and God have to tell Abraham to sacrifice his son? Like, why does there have to be bloodshed? So a lot of the surrounding cultures and nations sacrifice their children all the time to appease their gods, including some of the Canaanites. A popular one that many people probably have heard of is called Molech, later known as Beelzebub. In order for this god to be appeased, an infant had to be sacrificed burning alive in a structure that looked like this. And on the other side of the globe, the Aztecs or the Mexicans were also doing the similar thing of sacrificing children to appease the gods. In fact, the more blood the better, and it looked kind of like this. So all around the world this was happening, even without people knowing about it. So if we go back to Abraham, his story becomes about faith and being able to trust God even when things don't always look as they should. Or to know that Yahweh, God, always keeps his promises. So of course there's a lot of history and things that happen in between this time, and probably too long for me to explain in a short video. But during this time and even after, like, Yahweh is speaking to different people that are mentioned in the Bible, different prophets, that there was going to be a Messiah that saves the Israelites. Because during all this time, the Israelites are also facing a lot of persecution, either due to surrounding things happening with Babylon taking over and destroying their temples, and just exiling them and having to go through and having to live in Babylon for so many years. They were waiting for a Messiah, a king, to come and save them. And so they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing's happening. But then one of the prophets, Isaiah, gets a prophecy that the Messiah will be born of a virgin birth, and he was to be the atonement of everyone's sins. So because of the whole Abraham story, and again, like, all this history is amazing and incredible to learn about. But because of what happened with Abraham, Israelites started to sacrifice animals to Yahweh. In the book of Leviticus, in the Old Testament, there are requirements of what kinds of sacrifice that Yahweh would find acceptable or pleasing. They had to be animals without blemish, and they had to be sacrificed for certain things, like peace offerings or sin offerings, or just a burnt offering, which would be just kind of like, just for the sake of doing it, basically, like out of devotion or worship. But anyway, there was just they had to do this all the time, and it was very costly, and it was supposed to give that mindset like you have to do so much in order for you to cover for all the bad things that you do and all the sin in the world. So the Messiah was supposed to be the promise that was going to break this expectation of the Israelites and even the world to have to keep offering sacrifices in this way. And that offering to God would just be through the devotion of your actions and treating other people with kindness and love and respect. So the Israelites had waited for a very long time for this Messiah to come, and then they felt like he just wasn't coming, and there was just too much bad happening, and that, oh, God's just saying that. Maybe, like, God's not even real. God's not there for us. Even to this day, there are a lot of, like, Jewish people who really don't even believe that Christ was the Messiah. Which, again, is according to your interpretation of the story. Like, what do you think, it's really not about what anybody else says or things. Like, it's more so about your experiences and what you see within these stories. But a lot of the Pharisees and the people in the temple who were in charge of the worship and making sure that things were running smoothly with the burnt offerings and the sacrifices and everything like that, they just didn't really believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And I guess there really is no 100% proof besides your own faith of whether Jesus actually even existed or was actually really born of a virgin birth. But according to what the Bible says, and maybe even some other like written testimonies of what happened with Jesus, like this really did happen, and that Christ really was born of a virgin birth, and that he said things and acted in a way that was to come for what he was about to do, and he knew what his mission was when he came to this earth. People loved him, and then you had people who just didn't believe in him and thought that he was evil, and so they decided anyway that they were just going to kill him on the cross. And so while Jesus suffered immensely, and he cried out to God and everything, or he cried out to Yahweh, there was still this thing that happened where it appeared that he had died, and that there was even a spear that was stabbed on his side, and to see that he would wake up from it, he never did from that. So when he goes and is buried in the tomb, and Mary Magdalene finds him, she knows that he's actually awake, and that there's an angel, and it's him. Basically, she could see through the angel that it was him who was alive. And so through this like faith and testimony and everything, people believe that the atonement for sins was made, and that it was true according to faith. And there's really no like absolute like answer whether it really happened or not. And again, it's really just by faith, and if you don't believe in it, then it's up to, again, your interpretation of whether it actually happened or not. And of course, like Easter itself, like the day, like there's another like pagan holiday associated with Easter, but Easter in general, like as we celebrate it in most of the world, and for its reasons of Jesus rising from the grave and being the ultimate sacrifice, like that makes it a pretty big deal to people for the past. And even with the story of mentioning Abraham, the story of that even goes back further, of like even just the Adam and Eve story, because it all comes and stems from that story as well. It's still fascinating to hear the story and like to think about it in different perspectives and actually get like a deep historical context of why people find it so fascinating, or even just like from back in that during that time till now, and how people are still celebrating it and still have such an admiration and faith over what happened is amazing to me.